Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives show, where we explore gay history, one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is Chicago LGBT Hall of Famer and author, RickKarlin. So welcome to the show, Rick.
Well, thank you.
You're quite welcome. As you know, I've been focusing my research on gay bars that are defunct from all over the country, but a lot of people who may not be familiar with you may not know that you've been kind of immersed in the gay bar world for about, 30 or 40 years. You've had quite a history there. And I understand most of that is in Chicago, correct?
Correct. Yeah, almost exclusively. A little bit in Milwaukee, but not much.
Okay. So just so everybody knows, one of the things that you have accomplished is you have written a book called Paper Cuts: My Life in Chicago's Volatile LGBTQ Press. And I guess this is kind of autobiographical accounts of your experiences over decades working in the gay press in Chicago.
I worked for Gay Life newspaper. That was my sort of entry to the gay community. And then I moved on to Gay Chicago, where I worked up to entertainment editor, and I was with them for over 12 years. And from there, I went on to just about every other paper that worked in the, that was published in Chicago. It was kind of a cutthroat business in Chicago because people would get fed up working at one paper and go start another one. And then people from that paper would get fed up and go start another one. So at one point we had like 10 weekly publications going. So there was no shortage of ad dollars, thanks to Ronald Reagan and deregulating the phone industry, because that opened the line for phone sex ads. And their only overhead was advertising. So money was pouring in for those kinds of publications. And Gay Chicago was basically a bar rag, what was going on in the bars and things like that. And I wrote their gossip column, which was basically promoting what was going on in the bars for the advertisers. But with a little bit of gossip, if somebody got fired at a bar or something, we'd put it in the column. It became the most popular column in the paper. And I expanded it to include community activists and things, but it was still primarily bar focused, as most of the community activities were in the bars.
At the time, a lot of us looked at the bar rags as just kind of a throwaway publication that you'd glance through and see what was going on in town and then throw it away. But as you and I both know now, through our archival searches, the bar rags are an invaluable resource for finding information about one part of our community that was being lost in the history, which is the bars. Everybody wants to write about the activists and the laws and the political climate and everything else. And so few people have really focused on memorializing the bars that were such an important part of our daily existence back then. So Right. That's a project I'm working on right now. I'm working with the historian Suki de la Croix, and we're writing a book, an encyclopedia, if you will, of Chicago's gay bars, going all the way back to the 1920s. The problem was they didn't call them gay bars then; they were just bars where gay people hung out. Right.
So determining what's a gay bar and what isn't, sometimes it's just a matter of gossip columns and news accounts, and when places got raided and things like that. But we have over 1,000 bars so far in our listing.
And that's just from Chicago.
That's just Chicago, right? We're just doing Chicago. Between Suki's historical archives And my memory of things from the 70s on, we've been able to piece together quite a bit. And then Suki has interviewed a lot of people about what bars were like back in the 50s and 60s and 40s. And we even have an interview with somebody who went to one of the bars in the 30s, a speakeasy type bar.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yes.
So you personally, go ahead.
I think it's going to be a very interesting book, and I hope it sparks other cities people in other cities to do the same with their history, because so much of our history is in the bars because they were our community centers.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you're doing it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that book when it comes out. But you have a personal history with gay bars as well. What was the very first gay bar that you remember walking into?
Oh, it's very, very vivid memory. When I was a kid, I lived on the northwest side of Chicago, and for some reason, there was this one block that had, with 2 block stretch, that had a lesbian bar and 2 gay bars. It was a very residential blue collar working area, not the kind of place you'd expect that in the 60s. And one of the bars was called the 21 Club. And they had like an awning that went from the door out to the street, covered awning. And it was very, very shishi looking, at least to my 11-year-old eyes. And my mother and father had always said, you just stay away from that bar. And I don't know what they thought. I was going to go in and have a cocktail at 11, but maybe I would have. But so I would ride my bike, and they had 2 little windows in the front. And of course, they were covered with drapes, but every time I would ride my bike past, I'd kind of look in to see if I could see what was going on in there. And that ended up being my first gay bar to go to. It was, I was married at the time, and I worked nights. And one night I got off of work, and it was around a little after midnight, and I decided to check out the bar. And I walked in, and it was an old storefront type bar where the windows were up and the door was set back. And I stepped into the little vestibule area, put my hand on the doorknob, and pulled as hard as I could so that I could get the door open and get in there quickly. I didn't want anyone to see me. And as many bars did at the time, you had to be buzzed in. So it was locked. And I pulled so hard that my head hit the door, and then the buzzer went off. I opened it and I came in, and there was a long bar that ran down the entire length of the room. And of course, whenever anybody came in, everybody at the bars, their heads turned to look to see who had entered. And the bartender looked at me as I came in, and he said, "You knocked?" And everybody laughed. And then I was so embarrassed, I almost turned around and walked out. But I sat down, and I had a woman Coke. I remember that because I had never been a big drinker. And I started going there more and more after I got off of work at night. And I met some of the most wonderful people. There was an old, well, to my eyes then, I was 23, 22, an older guy who had done drag. Everybody called him Ginger. And he said to me, "When you do drag, always carry a fan, because that way, if you forget the words, you can hold the fan up to your face." That bar was around for at least another 20, 25 years. I think it closed around 2000 when the owner died.
And that was a neighborhood type bar.
Yeah, it was a neighborhood bar. It was, mostly working class, blue collar people. Some of the things that went on the pool table in that place, I was amazed at. I had never been in any bar before I'd been in that bar. So I had this picture that when you open the bar, it would look like the opium dens in Thoroughly Modern Millie. That's kind of what my vision of what a bar would look like. So it was like, in some ways it was a disappointment. In other ways it was a relief that it was just sort of a normal group of people for me.
Now, once you had started going there and becoming, to some extent, a regular at that bar, did you then kind of start to realize that, you know, maybe being married wasn't the right thing for you and start exploring your gay sexuality?
Well, you know what it was is soon after I got married, I realized it was a mistake. I mean, 5 months into the marriage, I realized this is not what I thought would. I thought the love of a woman would change me, and it didn't. So I was about to tell her that I was gay and we needed to divorce, and she told me she was pregnant. So that kind of got put on the back burner, and then I thought, well, maybe being a dad will be enough. And so by the time I walked into that bar, I was ready to make the exit from the marriage. And it sort of provided me the impetus. And it was also knowing there were other people out there. You know, I didn't know any gay people, except for the people at the bar. I didn't socialize with any of them other than in the bar, but just knowing they were out there made me feel better.
Right.
And then I met a man and fell in love, so that took care of that.
I think it was the same way for a lot of us, that we kind of realized there was a community out there as opposed to us just being an outlier and trying to figure out how we were going to deal with that. When you walk into that first bar and see that there are dozens, or in some cases hundreds, of people that shared a similar lifestyle to what you had in your head at the time, I think it was really an eye-opening experience for a lot of people.
Yes, it was very much so. That and the gay newspapers is what, yeah, those were my lifelines. And you picked up the gay newspaper at the gay bar, so it was a perfect combination of the two.
Right, absolutely. Now, you also have some history with several other iconic bars from Chicago that I know you've mentioned to me previously. And I think all of them have been included in my list of bars from Chicago. I'm pretty sure they have. The first one that comes to mind is Sidetrack.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your experiences at Sidetrack?
Well, when I was the entertainment editor at Gay Chicago, I had to go to the bars a lot. And I've never been the type to just go to a bar and sit for hours and talk. I did it at the 21 Club when I first came out because I was finding community, but I really didn't like to socialize that way. I don't know what it was. If I went to a bar, I wanted to be entertained. And so Sidetrack opened, and I covered the opening and things, but really wasn't on my radar until they opened, and they became, I think, one of the country's first video bars. And people were like, what, you're gonna go watch TV in a bar? You're just gonna stand there and watch TV? And of course, that was the time music videos and MTV were exploding. So that's where they were getting most of their source material. And it was okay. I mean, it was something unusual at the time. So I would go once in a while. But then on Monday nights were very slow. So they decided to specialize and show all show tune musical clips. So there'd be clips from, you know, movies that were, you could rent on VHS at the time, and or from something they recorded off the TV. And we would go and we'd sing along to them, you know, so we'd sing along to Oklahoma. And of course, as is a tradition in gay bars, piano bars, they would change the lyrics to make them a little bawdier. Same thing happened at Sidetrack. Instead of Oklahoma, it became You're a Homo. And there were other ones. And one day they were playing the polka from The King and I, the dance scene with Yul Brynner and Deborah Carr. And I just grabbed a friend of mine and we polkaed around the room. And I think it kind of broke the ice. People started interacting more to the videos. So they would take napkins and wave them in the air for music from Titanic, much later, but for the Poseidon Adventure, they would show it, and they'd have you know, people would rock from one side of the bar to the other, pretending they were sinking and things, and it became a fun, interactive piece that over the years has built a stronger and stronger following, to the point now where they do it Monday nights, Friday cocktail hour, and Sunday afternoons. And they've been covered in the new mainstream media news in Chicago a lot for it. And they've got a lot of non-LGBT fans that come in for it. And I actually went last night. I'm visiting Chicago right now. I live in Florida. And people, they have numerous rooms in the bar. And the show tune video bar doesn't open until 8 o'clock. The other bar adjacent to it was packed with people just waiting for the doors to open. And it was like, they opened the doors and they stormed in there like it would, you know, it was a rock concert or something. It was really amazing. And they mix all their own videos and do all sorts of special clips and montages, and they have one that's just people slapping each other from the movies that lasts about 5 minutes. And of course, Joan Crawford's featured in a lot of them. I guess she slapped a lot of people.
Apparently so.
Yes, and at home, I guess too. But so it was quite fun. I was there last night. Later than I should have been, and really enjoyed it.
Well, it's refreshing to know that a bar like Sidetracks, which you know, made an impression on you and had a part in your early days of bar hopping, has also still managed to survive this long, because as you and I both know, many bars have gone by the wayside. Some that were only a flash in the pan, some that were barely open before they closed, and others that lasted 3 or 4 decades and then suddenly closed in the last few years. So I think in Chicago, Little Jim's falls into that latter category. They were there forever and now they're gone.
Yeah, they're gone. The building's gone, torn down. They're building the gay health center's building a clinic on that property. Yeah, Little Jim's was one of the first bars on Halsted Street. Many people say it was the first, but it wasn't. There was actually a woman's bar on Halsted first, and a couple other ones a bit farther south, but it was the first one that was successful and lasted more than 6 months. When doing the research for the Encyclopedia, we found that the 6-month point is the tipping point for a lot of bars, because you pay your liquor license in every 6 months. And if people weren't making a go of it after the first liquor license was paid, they just didn't renew it. And that's somebody else would come in and take the liquor license for it, because the liquor licenses in Chicago are attached to the address, not the individual.
Right.
So that's, and we found that there were some addresses where we had 10 or 12 bars over the years listed at that same address. Some of them lasted 6 months, some of them lasted years, but the 6-month tipping point was very interesting.
Now, another long-lasting bar that you mentioned to me is one that I have had some experiences with in Chicago, and I remember it very fondly. They had 2 locations, actually. There was one downtown and one in Boys Town, and it was also an entertainment-oriented bar. It was a piano bar called Gentry.
Yes, and I'm going to pan my screen down so that you can see I am wearing my Gentry t-shirt that I bought from your website.
And I remember I walked in there the first time I was visiting Chicago with some friends. It was a little bit of an embarrassing moment. We had all gone in there and we're sitting at a table having our cocktails. And I cannot remember who the pianist was, but he reminded me of a character from the movie Trick. That, the piano player at the movie Trick that was very outgoing and interactive with the audience. And he tried to get the audience to interact a little bit. So he asked everybody going around from one side of the room to the other to tell their favorite or most embarrassing story about a sexual encounter that they'd had. And so people were telling stories about, oh, when I was in this city or in that town or this bar or that park, and all telling their stories to kind of get everybody to open up and be part of the show. And he got to my table, and the one friend that was there told a story, and he said, oh, that's a great story. And the other friend of mine told another story, and then he came to me, and I said, I'm kind of stumped because they took 2 of my stories. He started laughing hysterically. But it was a very entertaining bar. What was that like for you? You liked entertainment in bars. So what did you think of Gentry's?
Oh, I love Gentry. There was Gentry on Rush Street, which was right off of Michigan Avenue, which is Chicago's very Tony shopping area. That was the original. It was in an old mansion. So the main floor of the mansion, what would have been, I think, the parlor, was a bar. And then they took the back end, which I imagine was, a kitchen area or another parlor, and they turned that into the piano bar. And there was a curved staircase that went upstairs, and they rented it out to various restaurants, none of which did any kind of long-term business there. So a lot of times there was nothing up there, or they had a second piano up there. Sometimes they would have, and it was a much larger room upstairs. It was almost all one room. And so if they had somebody that was a bigger draw, they sometimes might have them upstairs. But yes, I love that bar, especially Sundays was open mic. And if there were any travel, and Sundays and Mondays were great because if there were, traveling shows like, Maine coming through or something, the cast would usually go to the piano bar, and Gentry was one of the few at the time. I think it was the only gay piano bar at that point. So a lot of people would go there, and I sat there, and Michael Feinstein was playing he was sitting next to me, and he went up and played. Another memory of mine being there is when the Gay Chorus Association, we had their meeting in Chicago. There were, 30 or 40 choruses from around the world that were in Chicago, and they descended on Gentry for open mic night, and they were singing. And at one point, a pianist said to the main piano player, "Do you mind if I play for some of my friends I accompanied them usually. So he moved over, he sits down to play, and there's a room full of 50 or 60 gay men singing in 4-part harmonies. This was a song that every chorus had learned to perform together at the conference. And this woman sitting next to me obviously had never been there before, and she wandered in and she said, "Do all gay bars have choral music like this?" I thought that was great. She just, yes, we can all instantly harmonize and work out complicated arrangements with no practice whatsoever.
And we all dress alike, so.
Yes. And yes, I like Gentry so much that when my husband and I had our commitment ceremony, we had it at Gentry. The restaurant upstairs was vacant at the time. So we used that upstairs space, and we had about 125 people for our ceremony and a reception afterwards. My nephew, who was 1 year old at the time, is now 28. So that'll give you an idea of how long ago that was. But it was really wonderful, and it was a beautiful location. They had like a white marble fireplace that we got married in front of. It, didn't take much flowers to make it a pretty place. And so that always had a very big part of my memories and feelings for the bars. And then they moved up to, they opened a second location on Halsted Street. They're trying to get us not to call it Boys Town, but in Boys Town, the Gentry on Halsted, and it did very well for, and Gentry was kind of, people weren't going there as much because there were other things in the area that had opened, and that was becoming a popular night destination, and so it was very hard to park. So people would go to the other one because it was easier to park. And then eventually they sold the building. I don't know if they owned it or if it was sold from them. And they opened another Gentry on State Street, which always felt like a Ramada Inn lounge. It just didn't have the atmosphere that you would want. It was a perfectly nice place, but just, looked kind of pedestrian. And it didn't do very well at all. And then the owner of Gentry, Dave Edwards, died, and the people he left the bar to didn't do well with it, and they ended up closing both of the bars and selling them. And there was another gay bar that went in on the one on State Street, but it didn't last a long time, a few years, I think.
And Gentry was obviously an example of another aspect of what role gay bars played in our lives, because, as you mentioned, you had your commitment ceremony there. You publicly started a relationship that has lasted decades in the gay bar, and you would not have been able to do that had you gone to, say, Applebee's.
Right.
That was something that back in those days, the bars performed other functions than just serving alcohol and providing entertainment. They were really, as you mentioned earlier, kind of community centers for us, and they played a very important part in our development as a community.
Yeah, and they still, they still do. Just the other day, the Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame inducted some new members, and normally they do it at the Chicago History Museum, and it's open to the public, and there's 500 people, and there's a reception beforehand, and the mayor comes, and presents the awards and everything. But because of COVID, and I'm on the board, because of COVID, we were not able to fundraise the way we did. So we really couldn't afford that kind of big event. And Sidetrack, the owners, Art Johnston and Pepe Pena, stepped up and they said, we'll host it and we'll provide 3 hours of open bar for free. That's pretty amazing, you know. And they put up a stage. They had a backdrop. They had video. They videoed the thing. They had it lit. I mean, they went all out on it. And the mayor came and presented the awards, and it was just like it would have been anywhere else except on a smaller scale. But we were able to get it going, do it again. And last year we couldn't have one at all. So this year we had one, and everybody was masked and vaxxed, and it was as safe as it could be for something like that. And it's all because of the generosity of the owners of Sidetrack. And they actually serve as, I mean, Chicago has an LGBT community center, but it's, you know, expensive to run that. And I understand they charge a lot. A lot of times Sidetrack will just step up and say, you know, we'll do it. If you can't do it elsewhere, we'll have the event here. And they leverage their, it's the most popular bar in Chicago, and they serve more top shelf liquor than almost any bar in the state. So they leverage their power with the liquor companies to get them to underwrite things. Like if the liquor company does not underwrite some sort of gay activity, they're not carried in the bar.
Wow.
So there are certain beers you can't get there because the beer companies don't give back to the gay community. That beer company or that liquor company, you know, that whiskey brand, the distillery or the parent company doesn't give back to the gay community, or they give to right-wing causes. They don't carry them.
So we have a bar with a sense of community.
Yes.
So another bar that you mentioned to me from Chicago's past that I have never been to, but I have heard of. It's one of the first bars I uncovered information about in my research. Was Carol's Speakeasy.
Mm.
And now some of the research that I've done on that bar indicates that there may have been a connection at that bar to a victim of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Not just a victim, numerous victims.
And you were in the gay media at this time, correct? When you were experiencing Carol's Speakeasy. So tell us a little bit about that place.
Well, I went to Carol's Speakeasy's grand opening. Before it was Carol's Speakeasy, it was another bar called Den One, and it was a very large space that was divided into 2 or 3 rooms. There was a big dance floor and bar area, and then there was like a back room of sorts, and I think there was even a kitchen. But it was a very popular bar. Mother Carol, Richard Farnham, was what they would call a bar personality. He was one of those larger than life characters, a bartender, and people would open bars and name the bar after him. And, you know, I don't know if he was getting a cut or whether he was just managing it or what, but so there was Carol's in Exile and Carol's something else. And then they opened Carol's Speakeasy, which is funny because the Speakeasy was supposed to be undercover and this thing was as flashy as you could get about getting in there. But I went to the grand opening of that because I was dating a bartender at the time. And that was even before I became active in the gay media. But so it was a very large bar, and they held a lot of events for the community as well. But when Jeffrey Dahmer was caught, it turned out that he picked up a number of his victims at Carol's Speakeasy. He would drive down from Milwaukee, which is about a 45 minute to an hour drive, if you're lucky, maybe 2 hours tops. And he would pick somebody up and take them home up to Milwaukee and, murder them and eat them. So when news of this broke, of course, Carol's immediately became a ghost town. People didn't go there anymore, even though the man had been caught for some reason. And that space never ever shook off that taint of having that. And the space sat empty for a good 30, 35 years. And finally they tore it down and they built a high-rise apartment on it.
Now, as I recall, while I was looking through old publications and old ads and online information, I discovered, as is not uncommon with many of the bars back then, numerous different logos and representations of the Carol's brand. Unlike bars of today, which tend to keep their logo for 10, 20, 30 years, back then, it seemed like it was almost at the whim of whoever was designing the ad that week, what they were going to put in it. But the one that stands out in my mind reminds me of the Rolling Stones' mouth, the big lips open with the tongue sticking out. Was that supposed to represent Carol in some way, or? Yes,
that when he would do drag, he would stick out his tongue at the audience, and he had a very long tongue. And he would wag at the audience. So that's where that comes from.
So that was a caricature version of the namesake of the bar.
Right. I mean, I think it was pretty much stolen from the Rolling Stones. I'm surprised they were never sued, because the 21 Club had to change its name to Legacy because it was sued by the 21 Club in New York after it had been open like 20 years or something. Somebody finally pointed it out to the 21 Club in New York, and they got sued and had to change their name. Like someone would confuse the two.
I know, but that happens, and it depends on. In the gay world, it wasn't as common because so many bars didn't ever register anything. I mean, there was no copyrighted logo or anything like that because they were operating under the radar to begin with.
Right.
So, it wasn't uncommon. In fact, one of the most unusual name bars that I've ever come across came from Birmingham, Alabama, and it was called Mabel's Beauty Shop and Chainsaw Repair. And not long, while it was still operating, someone in Texas opened a bar called Mabel Peabody's Beauty Parlor and Chainsaw Repair. And they were unrelated. But,
wow,
people just heard, oh, that was a cool name for a bar. Let's use that. And of course, the whole chain of Eagle bars are completely unrelated other than the concept of being like men's leather bars.
Right.
And they all use the same name all across the country. So I've seen that before.
Right. And usually very similar logos because there's only so much you can do with the word eagle and a picture of an eagle,
Although I have discovered, I think, about 15 of them that have gone out of business over the years. And a couple of them are a little abstract. A couple of the eagle logos, you look at it and you're like, wow, somebody was, really tripping when they designed that one. Because they
and a lot of times, the ads were done by a bartender who felt that he had an artistic streak or something.
Right.
I mean, when you look at the early bar ads, I was the editor of my school newspaper in high school, and the ads for the gay bars looked like the ads in the school newspaper. They were very amateurish, hand lettered, hand drawn. People didn't have the equipment most of them to do any kind of professional looking thing. So
Oh,
a lot
absolutely.
of times it was just a sketch or something.
I am well aware. I published a couple of gay publications in Atlanta in the 80s. And I cannot tell you how many hours I spent with an X-Acto blade and an amber overlay for the color, spot color, and the big grid paper to glue down I mean, everything was done by hand. It was not the way it is today, where you get on your laptop and whip it out in a publishing program, and everything's perfect. And there was a lot of work to putting out a publication back then.
Yes, cut and paste actually meant cut and paste, literally. Yeah. Yes, I worked in the publishing industry I because of my experience at high school doing the yearbook and the newspaper, I would help with the layouts of Gay Chicago magazine. Matter of fact, when we had the entertainment section, I laid out the entire section myself. So, I was used to doing that kind of thing. I don't know how good you would say they were, but they were, at least legible.
And we were grateful to have them. We were grateful to
Yes.
have them because they were providing us information that we wanted from our own community, which we would never find in the local newspaper or magazine. So
Right.
we were willing to overlook imperfections. So it was a different world back then.
Yes, definitely was. As I said, they served as community centers, if not for an entire city, but at least for a group of people that went to that bar. It was, a sense of community. Like the 21 Club was like that. It's not a place that like a lot of young gay people went to. It was really middle-aged, blue-collar men, and but they certainly had a sense of community. There were birthday parties there. There were, people celebrated being a couple in however they chose to describe it at the time before marriage. And, they had funerals there and things like that. I can't tell you how many different events I went to at the 21 Club.
Oh yeah, and
fundraising.
fundraising,
And fundraising too. Yeah.
political organizing. There were all kinds of things that went on at those bars.
Yes.
So the bars that we've talked about so far are mostly kind of what I would classify as kind of mainstream, entertainment-oriented, gay bars. But there's one bar that you mentioned that had an important place in your gay bar history that does not quite fall into that category. It's more of a kind of man's bar, the Manhole.
Oh, yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how it compared to the vibe of the other bars that we've talked about?
Well, it's interesting because the Manhole, this is a case of a bar going in where another bar had been. There's a bar called Christopher Street, which was one of the first, we called them Fern bars at the time. One of the first bars that had windows that were not blacked out. You could look in from the street, you could see people in there having cocktails. It was, kind of that out and proud 80s, early 80s feel, late 70s. And the owners were a gay couple, very, very gorgeous. They looked like two Ken dolls, very muscular. And they were backed by the brother-in-law of one of the guys who was a straight guy who owned the building that the bar was in. And eventually one of them succumbed to AIDS, and then the other one did. So they ended up closing Christopher Street, and the brother-in-law knew that it was a cash cow. It was in a perfect location. It was right across the street from Little Jim's, which was very popular. And so he made it into a leather bar. It's the only other leather bar in the city at the time. There were two. They were both far away from the Halsted Strip area. So it was a destination rather than stop in for the evening and go to another bar. So he opened Manhole, which was a leather bar, but it was a light leather bar, I would say. Although they did have a back room where they enforced leather rules. And it was, you had to have a major item of leather or be shirtless in jeans. And one time I was doing a benefit show, a fundraiser at another bar, and I was done up as Liza Minnelli in drag. And we decided to go out bar hopping afterwards, and we went to Manhole. So they let me in. I was surprised, in drag, but I'm partially because of the fact that I was the entertainment editor. I think they gave me a little leeway. They knew who it was. But I went to go into the back room, and the guy stopped me. He goes, "You can't go in the back room without a major item of leather." And I flipped my clutch up in his face. I said, "This purse, $65. That makes it a major item of leather." And I walked past him into the back room.
So they were a little bit more lenient than some of the really rigid bars. That now a lot of the Eagles did not have dance floors because that was not considered a part of the leather community. Was there a dance floor at Manhole, or was it strictly a cruise bar?
I think it was strictly a cruise bar. I think they eventually turned the back room into a dance floor. The bar that's there now, that's kind of how it's laid out. What was the back room of Manhole is now the dance floor of the bar. So,
and how long did Manhole last?
Oh, at least, I would say at least 10 years. I'd have to, have my information in front of me to double check for sure. But I would say, yeah, probably a good 10 years. And then it closed down, and then they tried to reopen it again at another location it was a basement side entrance to another bar, but you could enter on the side and go down the basement, which was set up as a bar. And they tried to make that a bunch of bars, including Manhole. I think that one only lasted like a few weeks. It was an unmitigated disaster.
So you've had all these experiences at different gay bars throughout Chicago, and I'm sure other cities as you traveled. And at one time, I'm sure Chicago, just like other cities of note, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta, had very large communities of gay bars. I mean, I know when I lived in Atlanta in the early 80s, there were probably 30 or more gay bars operating at one time. That was the case in Chicago as well, correct?
Oh yeah, there were, I think at one time our directory listed 87 gay bars.
Wow.
Which would include the suburbs, and it might have even included Milwaukee, because people would run up to Milwaukee for the night sometimes.
Right. And there's a great project from Milwaukee. One of the earlier interviews I did a couple of months ago was with Michael Takash, and he wrote a book called LGBTQ Milwaukee, or LGBT Milwaukee, talking about the history of Milwaukee, which has a pretty rich history too. Not exactly what you would expect maybe in Milwaukee, but it was pretty impressive. So you mentioned earlier the Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame, but what you did not mention is that you yourself have also been inducted in the LGBT Hall of Fame in Chicago.
Yes, yes.
And
I
you now
was
sit on the
inducted
board.
in, I was inducted in 1997. And that was probably the extent of my participation, is getting inducted. And the way people get in is they are nominated by the community at large. Anybody can go to the website and fill out a nomination form. And then all those nominations are reviewed by a panel of people. And that panel of people are people who have already been inducted. And so anybody can volunteer who has been inducted to serve on the selection committee. So that was the extent, as I would serve on the selection committee a couple of years. And that's, I mean, it's not a little undertaking if you say you're going to do that, because if they would get 100 nominations, you had to read every single nomination and, pick the 12 best or the 12 most deserving. And a lot of times there's ones in there that people are perfectly wonderful, but it doesn't rise to the level of extraordinary contributions that the Hall of Fame is known for, or what they're doing is just their job. They're employed as, like, especially during the AIDS crisis, a lot of nurses and things like that were nominated. Yes, but that they were doing their job, that's what they were hired to do. So unless they went way beyond what they were hired to do, they weren't really considered as for that role. So that was all I was involved with it. And then the city never really funded the Hall of Fame. It was funded by fundraising on its own, but it was supported by the city. So they would take care of the postage and mailing and things and coordinating things. And we would get meeting places, and we could meet at, like, the beautiful cultural center downtown, was where we would have induction ceremonies and things like that. And they would give us all that kind of support, but not financial support. Well, when Rahm Emanuel became mayor, he cut a lot of those programs, not just for the gay community, but across the board. A lot of the cultural programs were cut. A lot of the humanities programs were cut, and Hall of Fame was one of them. And it kind of floundered for a few years. They didn't induct anybody. They didn't do any nominations. And I just felt it was too important an organization to let go by the wayside. So when nothing had happened for 2 years, I offered to volunteer to come in and help get it going again. Because I'm one of those, I'm a rare combination of somebody who's creative but can really work a spreadsheet, and I seem to do pretty well with fundraising activities and organizational things. I had the world's first gay and lesbian wedding expo in the early 90s. And that ran for like 5 years, and then it outgrew what I could handle, which meant either quit my full-time job and take it over or let it go. And so I let it go. But so I came in, and last year we had an induction ceremony. It was virtual because of COVID. And this year we felt it was important to do something in person, which is why we did the one at Sidetrack. Even though we didn't have the money for the usual big one they would do, we did something. And I think it was very nice. And a lot of people liked it better. It was more intimate. People got to talk to each other more because it was in a bar. It wasn't in an auditorium seating. So anyway, I got involved with the Hall of Fame for that. And we are going strong, and we're already planning for next year.
Excellent. I'll look forward to seeing who else gets inducted up there. What I'm really excited about, though, is this project that you're working on with Suki, the Encyclopedia of Chicago's gay bar history.
Yes.
And you mentioned that you've discovered, I think you said 1,001, over 1,000.
Well, we're actually a little over 1,001. I think we're almost up to 1,100 now.
Wow.
Some of those will be culled out because they're really more. You find out they were really more of a restaurant than a bar, and we've been putting them in at this point because we weren't sure how we were going to determine what the cutoff would be. You know, there's no way on some of these we can find out how much was bar business, how much was restaurant business.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of it is mainly just how they presented themselves, I think, is what we'll be going with.
And back in the day, you know, some of the bars that I've researched go way back as well, some into the 19th century. And there was one, for example, in New York that was called Pfaff's, P-F-A-F-F. And Pfaff's was a restaurant in New York City, but below the sidewalk, they had a little bar area. You'd actually take the little, I guess, freight elevator down or a couple of steps and go into the basement below there. And they had a bar in there, which, as you mentioned earlier, was difficult to classify whether it was technically a gay bar. It was the kind of place that Walt Whitman would go hang out, and a lot of kind of artsy, esoteric, philosophical people that were known to be or suspected to be gay hung out there. And those kind of places are difficult to identify because, of course, nobody anywhere on the planet was advertising a gay bar in 1857.
Right.
So it's a matter of interpretation and folklore and other things that bring you to the decision of whether this should be acknowledged as a gay bar.
Yeah, well, Suki was very, he took a very interesting, because he's not a traditionally trained historian, he's more of a journalist. And he took the really smart idea of going through the newspapers and looking at arrest records that they would publish. And that would tell you a lot of times what was a gay bar, because they would call it, a house of lewdness or something.
Right.
And then he could kind of figure out what it was by piecing it together.
Yeah, and I've heard that from other people across the country, that even when you get back up until probably the 50s, that was a pretty good way of weaning out which bars were more inclined to be what we would now call a gay hangout.
Right.
Because even then there weren't very many advertising in the early part of the 20th century. So it was one way of identifying where our community would congregate at the time.
Right. And it was and the thing with the restaurants too is, in many cities you can't serve just liquor, you have to serve food and liquor.
Right.
For example, Evanston, the suburb just north of Chicago, to this day, you can't serve just liquor. You have to serve food and liquor. And it's many times it has to be a certain percentage of your sales, even. So determining what was, a gay or lesbian bar sometimes includes restaurants, sometimes doesn't. And sometimes was a lot of the times they were like the jazz clubs, were a lot more open-minded people were there. So gay people were welcome, although they were, again, not advertised as gay bars.
And discos as well. When you get into the 70s, the disco scene, I think almost everybody I know has declared that, Limelight, for example, was gay. And it was accepting, and there were a lot of gay people who went there. But in general, I don't think it was designed to be or particularly promoted to be a gay bar. It was a disco. And
right.
So there's a lot of even ambiguity, even as you get into the 70s with those types of bars. But
Right.
nonetheless, they all played an important part in the development of our community. And they gave us a place to go and be free and dance and hang out with people like us that were accepting of us and make us feel, more welcome in the world. So I think it's a very important project what you're doing with this Chicago history, because like you said, if every city could do this, we would have a wealth of information that is all but lost at this point.
Yes, definitely.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about some of your bar history in Chicago and about your paper cuts book project, as well as the project you're working on right now with Suki. And I thank you for being on the show with us and telling us about these stories.
Well, thank you for having me. I love looking at your site and looking at all the old bar logos. It's been very exciting.
Well, thank you.
And that concludes another segment of the GayBarchives podcast. You can find more podcasts at gaybarchives.com/podcast. We also have more information about this podcast and links to the other podcasts we have completed. We hope you enjoy your trip down memory lane.